Everyone thinks World War II's spies lived in the shadows, risking execution with every breath. But here's the thing nobody talks about. One man got paid a fortune by the Nazis to betray the Allies, received Hitler's personal medal for his brilliance, and somehow ended up as Britain's highest paid secret weapon. And the craziest part? He was never even in danger. The Germans loved him so much they kept sending him cash while he sipped tea in a London apartment, making up stories from tourist brochures. This is how one lie saved thousands of lives on D-Day, and why the man who told it couldn't look at his medal without feeling sick. Juan Pujol Garcia wasn't some trained operative or military genius. He was a hotel manager in Spain who watched his country tear itself apart and decided he hated fascists slightly more than communists. But here's where it gets weird. Instead of joining a resistance movement or fleeing to safety, he walked into the German embassy in Lisbon and volunteered to become a Nazi spy. The Germans actually believed him. They whisked him away to a Madrid safe house, taught him ciphers and invisible ink, and sent him out to destroy the British war effort. Except Juan had zero intention of helping them, and what he did next was so insane it almost got him killed before the British even knew his name. The year is 1941, and Juan's sitting in that Madrid safe house learning spy tradecraft from actual Gestapo instructors. They're showing him how to encode messages, how to spot British military movements, how to recruit assets. He nods along, takes careful notes, memorizes everything. These aren't amateurs teaching him. These are professionals who've been running intelligence operations across Europe, men who've caught and executed real spies, men who know every trick in the book. And Juan's absorbing it all, asking the right questions, showing just enough enthusiasm to seem genuine, but not so much that he looks desperate. He's playing a role, and he knows one slip in his performance means torture and death. The instructors show him how to use invisible ink made from common household chemicals. They teach him basic codes, how to hide messages in seemingly innocent letters, how to set up dead drops and arrange clandestine meetings. Then he goes back to Lisbon and does something nobody expected. He starts making everything up. He's never been to Britain in his life, but he's got tourist brochures and a library card. The Lisbon Public Library becomes his intelligence headquarters. He pores over British newspapers that arrive weeks late, studies railway timetables, memorizes the names of towns and military bases from travel guides written for peacetime tourists. So he invents 27 fake spies. A Welsh nationalist in Liverpool, an Irish sailor in Cardiff, even a Venezuelan agent in Canada who doesn't exist. Each one has a backstory, a personality, a reason for helping the Nazis. The Welsh nationalist is bitter about English oppression of his people. The Irish sailor hates the British for historical reasons. The Venezuelan is supposedly motivated by money and fascist sympathies. He sends Berlin elaborate reports about British troop movements based on train schedules he read in a guidebook. He describes military convoys he's never seen, troop concentrations in cities he's never visited, naval movements in ports he couldn't find on a map without his tourist guide. The Germans eat it up. They wire him cash. They praise his network. They think they've got the spy of the century. But Juan's sitting there with a pile of travel pamphlets, sweating bullets because he knows one mistake will expose him as a fraud. And the Nazis don't forgive fraud. And he makes mistakes, big ones. He reports that British soldiers in Glasgow love wine with their meals, not knowing that beer is the drink of choice in Scotland. He describes a naval convoy sailing from Liverpool when the tides would have made that impossible. He mentions flowers blooming in British parks during seasons when they'd be dead. But somehow, miraculously, the Germans don't catch these errors. Or, if they do, they attribute them to the confusion of wartime intelligence gathering. The money keeps coming. The praise keeps flowing, and Juan realizes he's stumbled into something terrifying. He's created a monster he can barely control, a web of lies that's growing more complicated by the day, and he's doing it all alone from a cramped apartment in neutral Lisbon with his wife wondering why he's always hunched over maps and newspapers. That's when he realizes he needs actual protection, and he does something that could have ended with a bullet in his head. See, Juan wasn't playing spy games for fun. He'd watched the Spanish Civil War turn neighbors into executioners, seen what happens when ideology crushes human decency. He'd seen children pulled from rubble, seen firing squads in village squares, seen friends disappear in the night never to return. He wanted to stop the fascists, but he was just one guy with a wife and kids who needed feeding, so he took the most dangerous gamble of his life. He walked into the British consulate and confessed everything. "I'm pretending to spy for Germany, but I want to work for you." The British officer behind the desk stares at him like he's insane. And why wouldn't he? They get walk-ins like this every week. Desperate refugees, con artists, mentally unstable people with elaborate secret fantasies. The consulate staff has learned to smile politely and show them the door, but Juan has proof. He's got copies of the messages he sent Berlin. He's got records of the money transfers. He's got the Germans' replies, praising his network, asking for more intelligence. The British officer's expression changes from skepticism to shock to something like grudging respect. Most people in that situation would have been arrested on the spot, or worse, dismissed as a lunatic. But something in Juan's desperation must have rung true, because word gets back to London, to MI5, to the people whose job is spotting useful madmen in a mad world. MI5 decided to test him. They give him puzzles only a genuine anti-fascist would solve. They ask him questions designed to trip up a German plant. They grill him for weeks, picking apart his story, looking for inconsistencies, trying to break his cover if he has one. And Juan passes every test, not because he's a trained spy, but because he's telling the truth. His hatred of fascism is real. His willingness to risk everything is genuine. And his bizarre gift for creating believable fiction from tourist brochures is too strange to be anything but authentic. They finally made a decision that changed the entire war. They brought him to England in 1942, smuggled him across the Channel in the dead of night, gave him the codename Garbo for his dramatic performance, and handed him a salary of $340 a month. That's more than most British colonels made. In today's money, that's roughly $16,000 a year, an enormous sum for someone who'd been scraping by in Lisbon. No prison cell, no interrogation chamber, just a comfortable London flat and a handler who treated him like family. His handler, a man named Tommy Harris, becomes more than just his contact. They develop a genuine friendship, the kind of bond that forms when two people share secrets that could get them both killed. Harris is an art dealer in civilian life, cultured and creative, and he recognizes in Juan a fellow artist. Except Juan's medium is deception instead of paint. And that's where the real confusion started, because now Juan was living a double life so twisted even he had trouble keeping track. He's getting paid by the British to pretend to spy for the Germans while actually spying for the British, who are paying him to send false intelligence that the Germans believe is real intelligence they're paying him to gather. The layers of deception are so thick that sometimes Juan has to sit quietly and remind himself which side he's actually on. But the comfortable apartment and the fat paychecks were just the beginning, because MI5 had plans for Juan that would make his Lisbon fantasies look like children's stories. Here's what makes this absolutely wild. Juan's fake spy network was so convincing that the Germans never questioned why a random hotel manager suddenly had access to Britain's deepest military secrets. They just kept wiring money and asking for more reports, which is exactly what MI5 was counting on, because they were about to use Juan's made-up spies to pull off the greatest military deception in history. And Juan had no idea he was about to save thousands of lives with nothing but a typewriter and his imagination. Once MI5 got their hands on Juan, they didn't just want him to keep the Germans happy, they wanted to weaponize his lies. So they sat him down in that London flat and said, "We're going to feed the Nazis so much false information they'll drown in it." But here's the genius part. They didn't just make up random stories, they built an entire fictional universe around Juan's 27 phantom spies, complete with personalities, grudges, and believable mistakes. One of his agents was supposedly a disgruntled Welsh nationalist who hated the English. Another was an Irish sailor with access to military ports. A third was some Venezuelan businessman who didn't exist anywhere except in Juan's reports. MI5 brought in psychologists, writers, intelligence analysts, the best minds they had, to help Juan craft these fictional personas. Each phantom agent needed a complete backstory that would hold up under German scrutiny. Where were they born? What were their grievances? How did Juan recruit them? What were their personalities like? The Welsh nationalist became a bitter railway worker who resented English control of Welsh coal mines. He was supposedly recruited when Juan met him in a pub, and they bonded over shared hatred of British imperialism. His reports had a distinct tone: angry, working class, filled with resentment. The Irish sailor was more mercenary, in it for the money but with ancestral grudges against the crown. His reports focused on naval movements he supposedly observed while working on merchant vessels. He was chatty, mentioned his family, complained about rationing, and the level of detail was insane. These fake people had fake arguments, fake personal problems, fake personality quirks that made them feel real. The Germans were so convinced that they based actual military decisions on information from people who never drew a single breath. But maintaining that many fictional lives without making a fatal mistake, that's where things got terrifying. Juan would sit at his typewriter for hours, writing messages in the voice of 27 different people. The Welsh nationalist would complain about English oppression between spy reports. The Irish sailor would mention his sick mother back in Cork. The Venezuelan would gripe about shipping delays and rising costs. Each agent had to maintain a consistent voice, consistent concerns, consistent personality traits across dozens of messages sent over months and years. Every message had to sound like it came from a real person with real concerns, because one slip, one detail that didn't match previous reports, and the entire house of cards would collapse. Juan developed elaborate filing systems to track each phantom agent's fictional life. What had they reported last month? What personal details had they mentioned? What was their emotional state? He kept notebooks filled with character profiles, like a novelist tracking the arcs of 24 protagonists, and it almost did collapse multiple times. There was this moment where Juan leaked real information about Allied invasion plans, but he sent the warning just late enough that the Germans got it after D-Day had already started. That was deliberate because it made the intelligence look authentic, while being completely useless. The timing had to be perfect. Too early and the Germans might actually use the information. Too late and it looked suspicious, like Juan was protecting the Allies. So he sent the message at exactly the moment when it would arrive, after the invasion began, but not so late that German intelligence would question why their prize asset was so slow. The Germans actually sent him an angry wire asking why his network hadn't warned them sooner. This was a dangerous moment. Juan's entire operation could collapse if the Germans decided he was incompetent or, worse, disloyal. So he did something brilliant and risky. Juan wrote back as his fake agents, blaming each other, getting into heated fictional arguments about who dropped the ball. The Welsh nationalist sent an angry message saying he'd warned Juan days ago, but Juan had been too slow to pass it along. The Irish sailor fired back that his information had been clear, but the Welsh nationalist had confused everything. Juan, as himself, sent anguished messages to Berlin, apologizing for the failure, blaming the chaos of wartime communications. The Germans believed every word. They never once questioned whether these people actually existed, because the emotional detail was too perfect. The arguments felt real because they contained the petty resentments and blame shifting that happen in real organizations when something goes wrong. The Germans recognized the pattern. They'd seen it in their own intelligence networks when operations failed. So instead of suspecting deception, they consoled Juan and told him to do better next time. And that's the thing about lies. Make them human enough, messy enough, and people will believe anything. What Juan understood that most spies didn't is that good lies aren't clean. They're complicated, contradictory, full of the same messy humanity that makes real life believable. Perfect intelligence is suspicious. Perfect coordination between agents looks fake. But a network where people argue, make mistakes, have personal problems, and occasionally fail, that looks real. He gave his phantom agents flaws, conflicts, personal drama that had nothing to do with spying. That's what sold it. The Welsh nationalist sometimes drank too much and his reports would be late. The Irish sailor occasionally refused to take risks because he was worried about his family. The Venezuelan was greedy and would demand more money. These character flaws made them human, made them believable, made the Germans trust them. The Germans weren't just reading military intelligence, they were reading about people they thought they knew. German handlers in Berlin developed favorites among Juan's phantom network. They'd ask about specific agents by name, inquire about their well-being, offer advice for managing difficult personalities. The Germans were emotionally invested in these fictional people, which made the deception even more effective. And the British handlers watching this unfold realized they'd stumbled onto something bigger than one double agent. They had a weapon that could reshape reality itself, make the enemy see ghost armies where none existed, believe in threats that were nothing but ink and paper. This was beyond traditional espionage. This was something new, strategic deception on a scale never attempted before. The British started calling it the double cross system, and Juan's network became the centerpiece of the entire operation. But the psychological toll on Juan was crushing. He was living in comfortable safety while writing messages that would send real German soldiers to defend empty beaches, waste resources on phantom threats, die for intelligence that came from his imagination. Every night, Juan would finish his work and sit in his apartment, thinking about the men on the other end of his lies. German soldiers who would be positioned wrongly because of his reports. German commanders who would make fatal decisions based on his fiction. He wasn't pulling a trigger, but his words were just as lethal. Every payday from the British Treasury was a reminder that he was being rewarded for a betrayal the Nazis thought was loyalty. He'd cash his check and think about the German handlers who praised him, sent him money, trusted him completely. They thought he was a hero. They thought he was risking his life for the Reich, and he was taking their money and their trust and using both to destroy them. And every fake message he sent brought him closer to the moment when all those carefully constructed lies would either save thousands of lives or collapse and expose him as the fraud he'd always been. The weight of it was enormous. Juan started having nightmares. He'd wake up in cold sweats, convinced the Germans had figured out his deception, convinced they were coming for his family. His wife could see the strain, but didn't know the cause. He couldn't tell her the details for security reasons. And that moment was coming faster than anyone expected because the Allies were planning the biggest amphibious invasion in history, and they needed the Germans looking the wrong way. You know what's insane? The entire German military command was basing life or death decisions on reports from people who existed only in Juan's head. They were moving actual divisions, positioning real tanks, allocating genuine resources to counter threats that were pure fiction. German generals were looking at maps covered in pins representing Juan's phantom agents, drawing conclusions from data that had no connection to reality. And Juan was sitting in his London apartment, inventing arguments between his fake spies to make the lies more convincing. But the stakes were about to get so high that one wrong detail could kill thousands of Allied soldiers, and the Germans had to believe every single word. June 1944. D-Day is weeks away, and Allied commanders are losing sleep over one nightmare scenario. The Germans figure out they're landing at Normandy and position their full strength to meet them on the beaches. Thousands of young soldiers would die in the surf before they even reached land. The Allies had been planning Operation Overlord for years, but success depended on achieving tactical surprise. The Germans knew an invasion was coming, they just didn't know where or when. And if they guessed right, if they positioned their panzer divisions correctly, the invasion could turn into a bloodbath that would set the war back years. So they came to Juan with the most important mission of his life: convince the Nazis that the real invasion is coming at Pas de Calais, 150 miles northeast of the actual landing zone. Not just suggest it, make them believe it so completely that they hold entire divisions in reserve, waiting for an invasion that will never come. Pas de Calais made perfect sense as an invasion site. It was the shortest crossing of the English Channel, just 20 miles of water compared to Normandy's 100 miles. It offered the quickest route to Germany. It was the obvious choice, which is exactly why the Allies chose Normandy instead. But making the Germans believe the obvious required more than just suggesting it. Juan's network had to build a case so compelling, with so many layers of corroborating evidence, that German intelligence would dismiss Normandy as a diversion even after the invasion began. And Juan had to do this while maintaining the fiction of all 27 fake agents, keeping their personalities consistent, making the intelligence seem urgent, but not suspiciously perfect. One wrong word, one detail that smelled off, and the entire deception collapses. Except Juan did something so brilliant and so emotionally manipulative that it's still studied in intelligence schools today. He started sending Berlin frantic messages about troop concentrations in southeastern England, 80 divisions supposedly gathering for the real invasion at Pas de Calais. His fake agents were observing tank divisions, spotting landing craft, reporting military rail traffic. The Welsh nationalists saw American troops massing near Dover. The Irish sailor reported unusual naval activity at Portsmouth. The Venezuelans somehow had access to classified documents about invasion plans targeting Calais. The reports came in from multiple independent sources, all corroborating each other, all pointing to the same conclusion. This is what made it so convincing. The Germans weren't just hearing it from Juan, they were hearing it from his entire network, each source adding another piece to the puzzle. But here's the genius move. Juan had his phantom spies argue with each other about the intelligence. The Welsh nationalist was convinced Normandy was the target. The Irish sailor insisted it was Calais. They sent angry wires to Juan's headquarters, accusing each other of being wrong, of missing obvious signs. One phantom agent sent a furious message saying the others were idiots, that obviously the Allies would choose the shortest crossing. Another fired back that the Allies weren't stupid enough to attack where the Germans expected them. A third suggested maybe there would be multiple invasions. It looked like genuine confusion, the kind of messy disagreement that happens in real intelligence networks, and that's what sold it. Perfect agreement would have looked suspicious, but a network where intelligent people looked at the same evidence and reached different conclusions, that looked exactly like real intelligence gathering, where the fog of war makes certainty impossible. The Germans intercepted these messages. They were meant to be intercepted, and saw exactly what Juan wanted them to see: a functioning spy network with multiple sources having authentic disagreements about incomplete intelligence. It was the mess and uncertainty that made it believable. Then, the night before D-Day, Juan sent Berlin an urgent warning. The invasion is happening now at Normandy. But he sent it just late enough. The message arrived after the first Allied soldiers were already hitting the beaches. The Germans received it too late to change anything, but not so late that it looked suspicious. The timing was calculated down to the hour. Juan sent the message at 3 a.m. on June 6th, knowing it would take several hours to decode, analyze, and reach decision makers. By the time German high command received the warning, Allied troops were already already ashore. In fact, it made Juan look like his network had finally gotten solid intelligence, just not fast enough. And that's when the magic happened. The Germans didn't panic and rush forces to Normandy. They believed Juan's earlier reports about Pas-de-Calais being the main target. In their minds, Normandy was the diversion, the fake invasion meant to pull troops away from where the real attack would land. This was the genius of the deception. The Germans knew the Allies would use diversionary tactics. So, when Normandy happened, their immediate assumption was that it was the diversion for a larger invasion elsewhere. And every message from Juan's network had primed them to believe that larger invasion would come at Calais. So they held 19 divisions in reserve at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for Juan's ghost armies to appear. 19 divisions. That's roughly 250,000 soldiers, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and support equipment, all sitting idle, defending empty beaches, while the real invasion happened 100 miles away. Those divisions never moved. Even as reports came in about Allied forces pushing inland from Normandy, German high command kept those divisions at Calais. Even as days turned into weeks and the Normandy beachhead expanded, they waited, because Juan's network kept sending reports about the real invasion being imminent. They sat there for weeks while the Allies established their beachhead at Normandy, while thousands of soldiers who would have died in the initial assault made it inland, while the whole invasion succeeded because the Germans were defending empty beaches against enemies that didn't exist. Military historians later calculated that Juan's deception may have saved 10,000 to 20,000 Allied lives in the first crucial days of the invasion. Those 19 divisions, if they'd been at Normandy, could have pushed the Allies back into the sea. Instead, they sat uselessly at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. And back in London, Juan was staring at his typewriter, knowing exactly what his lies had accomplished. He'd done it. The greatest deception in military history had worked, but he couldn't celebrate. Couldn't tell anyone outside his small circle of MI5 handlers. Couldn't even fully process what he'd achieved because the operation was still ongoing. He had to keep up the fiction that the real invasion was still coming. Days later, a German courier delivered a package to his apartment. The Iron Cross, second class, personally awarded for his invaluable service to the Reich. The package arrived with a personal note from German intelligence command, praising his network's excellent work and apologizing that the warning about Normandy hadn't been received in time. They still believed. Even after D-Day, even after the deception had served its purpose, they still trusted him completely. Juan held that medal with the swastika stamped on it, and something broke inside him. This wasn't a trophy, it was a curse. The monsters he despised had honored him for destroying them. The British paid him a fortune for the same deception, and he couldn't tell anyone the truth except the handful of MI5 handlers who knew what he'd really done. He put the medal in a drawer and tried not to think about what it represented. Every time he looked at it, he saw the faces of German soldiers who died because they trusted him. He saw the commanders who decorated him for betraying them. He saw the impossible contradiction of being a hero to both sides of a war for the exact same actions. But even after the war ended and the guns fell silent, Juan's story didn't get the ending you'd expect. Think about the psychological weight of that moment, holding a medal from Hitler's Germany, knowing you earned it by saving Allied lives, paid by both sides for the same elaborate fiction. Most people would crack under that kind of contradiction, but Juan just tucked the medal away and disappeared into a quiet life, because the truth was too dangerous to tell and too complicated to celebrate. And that's where the story should end, except it doesn't, because the world almost forgot the man who saved D-Day. After the war ended, MI5 did what intelligence services always do. They buried Juan's existence. No public recognition, no medals from Britain to match the German one collecting dust in his drawer, nothing but a polite suggestion that he'd disappear. The reasons were practical. The double-cross system was still classified. Britain didn't want the Soviets, now shifting from ally to adversary, to know the full extent of their deception capabilities. And they didn't want future enemies to study their methods. But it also meant that Juan's incredible achievement would vanish into classified files, perhaps forever. So Juan took his family and vanished into Venezuela, living under a fake name, working anonymous jobs, never speaking about what he'd done. The world thought Agent Garbo was either dead or had never existed at all. He worked in a bookshop in Caracas. He lived in a modest apartment. He was polite to his neighbors who thought he was just another European refugee trying to rebuild his life after the war. Nobody knew. Nobody suspected the man who'd saved thousands of lives and changed the course of history was just another face in the crowd. And Juan kept the secret for decades, watching D-Day anniversaries on TV, seeing other spies get books and movies made about them, while he stayed silent in the humid streets of Caracas. Every June 6th, he'd watch the ceremonies and the documentaries, see the veterans marching, hear the speeches about courage and sacrifice, and he'd think about the 19 divisions that never moved, about the lives saved by phantom agents who never existed, about the incredible secret secret he carried alone. His own children didn't know the truth. His neighbors had no idea the quiet foreigner down the street had altered the course of history with nothing but lies. He couldn't tell them. The Official Secrets Act bound him to silence for life. Even in Venezuela, even decades after the war, he kept the secret because that's what you did when you worked in intelligence. You carried your secrets to the grave. And the crushing irony is that the greatest spy of World War II, the man whose deceptions saved more lives than most generals, spent his old age in obscurity because the truth was classified. It wasn't until 1984, nearly 40 years after the war, that a British researcher stumbled onto declassified files and tracked Juan down. The researcher, Nigel West, was writing a book about wartime intelligence operations. He found references to an agent codenamed Garbo in newly released documents and became obsessed with finding out what happened to him. British intelligence had assumed Juan was dead. They'd lost track of him decades earlier, but West was persistent. He followed leads through immigration records, contacted Spanish intelligence services, eventually traced Juan to Venezuela. When he showed up at Juan's door, the old man was shocked. He thought his story would die with him. They found him in Venezuela, an elderly man living modestly, still carrying the weight of his double life. When they asked him about the Iron Cross, about getting paid by both sides, about the 27 fake spies and the D-Day deception, Juan just shrugged with that same quiet intensity he'd had in wartime Lisbon. "I did it for humanity," he said. Not for glory, not for the money that had long since been spent on raising his family, but because he'd seen what fascism did to human beings and decided one person could make a difference. He talked about the Spanish Civil War, about seeing neighbors turn on each other, about the bodies in the streets of Barcelona. That's what drove him. Not abstract politics or grand strategy, but the simple moral clarity of knowing that fascism destroyed human dignity and had to be stopped. The British finally acknowledged him, gave him some official recognition, let him visit England one last time. In '94, at age 72, Juan returned to Britain for the first time since the war ended. The government gave him a small ceremony, a certificate of service, some kind words. It was something, but it felt hollow after 4 decades of silence. But by then, most of the people who'd worked with him were dead. The world had moved on to other wars, other spies, other deceptions. Tommy Harris, his handler and friend, had died in 1964. Most of the MI5 officers who'd known him were gone. The veterans of D-Day were elderly or dead. The world that remembered the war was fading, and Juan went back to Venezuela, where he died in 1988, still carrying the story of how he'd been thanked by the enemy for destroying them. He died quietly, in his apartment, surrounded by his family. The obituary in the local paper mentioned nothing about his wartime service, just another elderly European who'd lived out his days in Caracas. What haunts me about Juan's story isn't the espionage or the clever lies, it's the loneliness of being the only person who knows the full truth of what you've done. He couldn't celebrate his victories because they were classified. He couldn't process the trauma of living a double life because talking about it would have violated official secrets. He just had to carry it alone until history finally caught up with him decades too late. Imagine living with that. Imagine knowing you'd done something extraordinary, something that saved thousands of lives, and not being able to tell anyone. Not your children, not your friends, not even your wife. At least not the full truth. Just carrying that weight in silence year after year, watching the world forget you ever existed. And that's the part of war nobody talks about. The people who save thousands of lives in silence, who bear impossible contradictions without breaking, who get paid and honored and thanked by the very people trying to kill them. War creates these impossible situations where normal moral categories break down. Juan was a hero for lying. He was loyal to Britain by betraying Germany's trust. He saved lives by helping kill people. Every normal rule was inverted, and he had to live with those inversions eating at his conscience. Juan's story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about loyalty, about the price of deception, about whether you can lie your way to truth. The Germans trusted him completely and he betrayed them. The British used him ruthlessly and paid him well. And Juan just kept typing, kept inventing, kept weaving a web of ghosts that changed history while he remained invisible himself. That's the real legacy. Not the medals or the money, but the quiet courage of choosing to stand against darkness even when nobody would ever know your name. Juan's silence protected secrets, but your family's untold stories deserve to be heard. Share them below and subscribe for more forgotten history.